Just finished watching the Final Fantasy XVI debut trailer from the recent Gamescom conference. Thought I'd share my first impressions with you guys as a longtime fan of the series, and we're going to keep it low-key, we're going to keep it comfy, so grab a beverage and let's start with the art style. It's interesting to see FF go back to more of a medieval style. I mean, we've had quite a few sci-fi entries in the modern era of Final Fantasy. And I'm not counting the online. I'm talking mainline single-player Final Fantasies. We've had 13, very, very sci-fi. I think 7 has a lot of elements of cyberpunk as well. And the remake just came out, obviously, so it's still fresh in our minds. And then 15 had that kind of real-world aesthetic, which was original for sure. Intriguing to see that they've decided to go back to a more traditional fantasy art style. I guess it doesn't look as cutting edge as some of the Final Fantasy debut trailers used to hit you with. You'd always get that impact of like, whoa, these graphics are mind-meltingly good, right? Looks good, definitely looks good, but I guess that classic fantasy aesthetic, it's been done a lot over the last generation. The Witcher 3 immediately springs to mind, especially when you see the spells flying, the fire spells and the acrobatic combat. I'm getting a Witcher vibe. So my only criticism is perhaps this is not the most original art style I've seen in a Final Fantasy game, but that's coming from someone who, my personal preference in a Final Fantasy game is I like it when they combine weird combinations. Like, when you have 8, which is sci-fi but mixed with this like European aesthetic, and 9, which had that kind of steampunk combined with fantasy. 15, I wasn't really the biggest fan of the gameplay or the story, but the visuals, the art design, that was pretty cool. Like that kind of everyday, almost mundane kind of urban, aesthetic combined with fantasy, that was really cool. This one, I'm getting straight up fantasy, medieval vibes. That's fine, absolutely fine. Definitely more appealing to Western tastes, I think, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why they chose to go in this direction. Maybe they're trying to play a little safer this time as opposed to going balls to the wall crazy. Look at Final Fantasy X, that strange tropical Asian sci-fi post-apocalyptic. That was pretty out there, but really cool, really original. And this, for me, it evokes something like a kind of Game of Thrones type vibe. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not, but you never know. I think a lot of these Japanese developers, when they do their own spin on a traditional Western style fantasy game, you tend to get something really unique, actually. But we'll see how it goes, because if the story's a home run, it could be very memorable. So enough about the art design. Let's talk about the gameplay from the looks of it, because at first glance, it looks kind of like an evolution of the Final Fantasy XV system, which was you kind of held down buttons, it auto-attacked, auto-locked on. One of the most shallow RPG battle systems I think I've ever encountered. And I hear that the method that they used for the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I haven't played, was kind of an improvement on this ARPG style that the Final Fantasy series seems to be leaning more towards these days. It seems like even after all these years, they're still struggling to find this balance between flashy visuals and RPG mechanics, but because Square are so fixated on the spectacle of their battle system, right? It has to look flashy. So as far back as FF13, I remember that they were simplifying their battle systems to an insane degree for a variety of reasons. Not only to kind of make things faster, more impressive, but they also wanted to make the series less intimidating for newcomers. So the fact that they've kind of leaned completely into the action RPG system now, I guess I have to just make my peace with that. But I think if they can incorporate more strategic RPG elements into this system, that would be gold, because a good RPG really needs that backbone of a decent battle system that is fun and strategic and actually allows you to use your brain. And I've noticed that in a lot of modern RPGs, especially the big budget ones, they do struggle with this same problem. I mean, just take The Witcher 3, for example. I mean, like, the story is on point, the visuals look amazing. The systems are complex and interesting, but that is definitely the weakest side of The Witcher 3, in my opinion. I mean, the combat system is just a little bit too janky. There's just something kind of unintuitive about it. It's kind of unsatisfying. So I'm curious to see what FF16 can do to remedy these issues, if they could somehow nail it. Because, I mean, take a game like Dragon's Dogma, for instance. That game, I mean, it kind of fails on the story front. I mean, the story is just kind of a flavor, basically, for that game, but the combat system is super interesting. It's an action RPG, but it's fun, and it's got that arcadey just grit to it. It's great. So it can be done, but when will a modern RPG be able to nail all three? You know, amazing visuals, story on point, combat system also really good. Let me know in the comments if you can think of one that actually nails all three, because as far as Final Fantasy goes, they have been struggling to modernize that formula for quite some time, and yeah, I mean, we'll see what happens, but let's move on to some other details. The characters. First of all, the character design. I mean, still definitely has that Japanese feel to it. Main character, hey, I mean, a little bit more generic than your usual crazy-looking FF design. So, just judging by what the main cast looks like and the suspicious lack of leather and belts, I'd have to guess that Nomura did not design these characters. I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know anything about the production of Final Fantasy XVI. This is literally the first contact I've had with anything to do with this game. I didn't even know it was in production until Gamescom. I was like, whoa, Final Fantasy XVI, that's interesting. I guess they were keeping it on the down low, seeing as Square Enix tend to cuck themselves with release schedules. I mean, they're infamous for it. So, yeah, I mean, it's refreshing to see a Final Fantasy main character that looks a little bit more masculine, a little bit more weathered, and these characters feel like, yeah, this world that they inhabit is this gritty fantasy world where, yes, of course, there's not much hair gel around. I like the look of it, and I approve of the female characters. They look feminine, they're attractive, there's a distinct lack of subversive, far left virtue signaling going on here. It's what I expect from Japan. It's what I appreciate about the Japanese game industry. They're making products for us to enjoy, not to harangue and chastise the toxic white male gamer. None of that. Just cute waifus for us to all enjoy. So that is a great thing, frankly. It's very, very refreshing. And there also seems to be quite a big focus on summons in this game. In fact, I noticed the main cover art looks like Ifrit versus Phoenix, and I think these summons are going to play a big part in the story and in the lore of Final Fantasy XVI by the looks of it. And I also noticed Titan in there, Shiva, obviously, like the new design of Shiva as well. So yeah, I mean, the summons are looking cool, very cool. And interesting to note that there was blood depicted in this trailer. There looks like a little bit more violence, which ties in more with the gritty medieval setting, so I like that. I mean, that's a little different. You don't usually see blood in Final Fantasy games. I mean, I think the most blood depicted in an FF game to date was probably the original Final Fantasy VII. I mean, there were a lot of quite gory scenes, I mean, the Genova blood trail, Cloud getting impaled by Sephiroth, a lot of death, a lot of tragedy in that game. So it would be interesting to kind of get back to that darker tone with 16. And, while we're on the topic, I mean, it's interesting how the remake of Final Fantasy VII actually lost a lot of that dark tone. Purely because, I mean, they did take more of this fan service, this weeby, pandering kind of approach to that game. And I guess the idea was to enhance the original, but really, I mean, it just took away. It took away so much of the impact and of the real core of that game, which is, it is a dark game. And I like the fact that this is a new entry in the series. This is an all-new universe, and there really is no risk of anything from my childhood being ruined by this game. Not mentioning any names, Nomura, But, yeah. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about the music. Obviously, in the past, the music was one of the core pillars of a good Final Fantasy, and you have legendary composer Nobuo Uematsu to thank for that. I've been replaying Final Fantasy IX recently, and the soundtrack is just so great. It carries the game. Without the soundtrack, you don't have the emotional connection to the characters. It actually does so much of the heavy lifting. It's mind-blowing, but Nobuo is retired. I'm assuming Nobuo did not do the music for this game, but first impressions, really solid, lots of choral, chants, very, very high energy. And of course, you have the rearranged Final Fantasy title, that harp theme that you get at the beginning of every FF game. We can see it here reimagined. And I like the spin they've got on that little melody this time. And I'm impressed with the music actually, in this trailer at least, because I'd say since the departure of Uematsu, I feel like the music has taken a turn for the worse in terms of the Final Fantasy series. I mean, I think 13 was the one that really, there was a couple of good songs on that soundtrack, but there was also a lot of cringe too. There were vocal tracks. The Chocobo theme had vocals on that game. That was just a cringe singularity. And 12 had a lot of really generic and kind of boring tracks. I can't vouch for the soundtrack for the online games, but 15 also. It's hit and miss, really hit and miss. Some really great atmospheric tracks when you're wandering around. But then, some of the battle themes had electric guitar, metal chuggy electric guitar. And of course, Uematsu utilized, different genres of music when thematically appropriate. Just take the opening for FF10, right? The Blitzball game. You had that sweet metal track in the background. Made sense for that context. But in 15, I'm wandering around the overworld, I get into a fight, and suddenly, dun dun dun, with an orchestral epic music, with chuggy guitar in the background. Ever since Advent Children, where they added electric guitar in the background of One Winged Angel, that's blasphemy. How dare you? You gotta think that Nomura was behind that decision as well. But anyway, really, Nobuo is the king, as far as I'm concerned. And this, although this is not on his level, it's damn good. So there you go. And while we're on audio, let's talk about the voice acting. This is another pleasant surprise, actually. Because, the voice acting in 13 was god-awful. I don't think I'm the only one to have disdain for the English localization for that game. But, just take the character of Vanille, for instance. She had this god-awful Australian voice actress. And, the way they directed the voice, too, was just the most anime weeb shitfest. Not even, the Daniel Day-Lewis of video game voice acting, Troy Baker himself, could save that one. But one of the good things about FF12 was how solid that cast was, because instead of just this weird smorgasbord of regional accents like 13 went for, which was just completely jarring and it just ruined the immersion, 12 had a real solid, mostly British voice cast. I think Vaughn had an American accent, but it was solid, and the actors really kind of brought those characters to life. And actually, this trailer really reminds me of that level of quality. Perhaps it's not as good. Balthier and Fran had some really cool voices for 12. This one, yeah, I really like it. The voice cast are definitely turning in a solid performance, and it sounds like mostly British accents. As far as I can tell, I'd have to go back and rewatch it, but I like that. I like it when a fantasy game has British accents, because it really does enhance the immersion. If you're going to have a European-style medieval fantasy, go ahead and cast British people. FromSoft know this. Hidetaka Miyazaki, he works with the same localization company, Frog Nation. He works with them on pretty much every modern FromSoft game, and to the point where in the Souls series, those games actually default to the English localization, even in Japan, because that's what gives a dark fantasy, or just in any fantasy game, a feel of authenticity. Look at Skyrim, for instance. Skyrim is a great game, has great atmosphere, but the voice acting is just shit. You have one guy that's trying to do an Arnold Schwarzenegger impression over here, and then another guy who's just an American guy. There's no cohesion. And I mean, I like The Witcher 3 too. I like the Witcher series, but Geralt, like, why does he have an American accent? Why do some Witchers have an American accent? Do we get a lore explanation for that? Because that would help, but ultimately there's something kind of jarring about hearing an American accent in a fantasy setting. At least for me, anyway. So the fact that in this trailer, all I'm hearing is Brits, good move, high IQ move. And it reminds me of 12. 12 had a really, really solid voice cast, so very cool to see some consistency with the fantasy accents in FF16. So I guess I'll just wrap up my first impressions. Usually I'm quite negative, honestly, especially when it comes to Final Fantasy and video games in general. Just see my last video, for instance, which that title's a little bit of a clickbait title, but anyway. It's cool. Is it what I want from Final Fantasy? Probably not, but I'm one of those old school fans who will spurg until the cows come home, until I get like a one-to-one exact old school turn-based ATB Final Fantasy, and that's never going to happen, but whatever. If I'm going to be optimistic, I'd say this looks pretty solid. I actually came in with quite low expectations, and I was expecting to see something that would piss me off, if I'm being honest, but no. Overall, pretty cool. I like what I'm seeing, and I like that there's nothing distasteful about this iteration by the looks of it. It's doing something different for sure. So there you have it, folks. That's my first impressions of Final Fantasy XVI. Yep, I'll be getting back to my usual unhinged ranting about the intersection between politics and video games very shortly. Just thought I'd mix it up a little bit with this video. Bye-bye.